Good afternoon, everybody. Mr. Sabi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good evening, Dr. Lavi. Welcome to China Tribunal. And sorry for encroaching on your time at this late night. Dr.
That's
Lavi,
okay.
You have submitted a report to this tribunal.
Mr. Sabi, I, or one of us, ought to remind Dr. Lavi. Dr. Lavi,
Yes,
thank you for coming to the tribunal, for being present at the tribunal. And I'm sure you understand that it's very important that the evidence you give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lavi. Dr. Lavi, in your paper, you refer to one of your patients who got an appointment in China for 2 weeks, hence to go and have a heart transplant. Can you explain that, please?
Yes, that particular patient has been hospitalized in our department at the Sheba Medical Center, which is the largest medical center in Israel and the largest heart transplant unit in Israel. Back in 2005, he has been hospitalized for almost a year, and he has been on the top list of transplant candidates for heart transplantation. The days and nights went by, and we couldn't find a suitable heart donor for him. And one day on rounds, he approached me and told me that he was told by his insurance company to go to China in 2 weeks' time, and he set up a specific date. As he told me, he was scheduled to undergo heart transplantation on that particular date. And I looked at him and I waited for him to smile and asked him, you understand, nobody can schedule a heart transplant 2 weeks ahead of time. The patient has to die within the 24 hours prior to surgery at most. And he said, I don't know. That's what they told me, and that's what I'm going to do. And that's exactly what he did. He went to China on that particular day and got his heart transplant on the specific date that he was promised ahead of time.
Yes, and that forced you to start your investigation into this matter.
That's correct. This patient has been the first Israeli patient who underwent a heart transplantation in China. Prior to him, I've heard and learned for several years before that, more than 200, or I would say 250, Israeli patients who went prior to that patient to China and came back with a kidney. Now, being a heart transplant surgeon, I didn't pay too much attention at that time to those kidney transplanted patients because I thought they went to China and bought one of the 2 kidneys of a poor Chinese farmer who wanted to improve his economic situation. Not that I'm approving of that, definitely not, but that's what I thought. This patient, who has been, as I said, the first heart transplant patient who got his heart in China and on a specific date, got me totally by surprise, and I started to investigate. And it was then that I learned for the first time about the practice that went on actually since 1984, when the Chinese has passed the, at that time, secret law, which enabled them, their surgeon, to procure, to harvest hearts from executed prisoners and transplant them into other people. This particular patient has been followed by almost, I would say, 10 or 11 more patients, Israeli patients, I should say, who went to China and got hearts on specific dates that they were promised ahead of time. And what puzzled me and what pushed me to go into a public campaign in Israel was the fact that due to the fact that at that time, in the year 2005, we in Israel did not have any organ transplant law, those Israelis who went to China were fully reimbursed for their transplant in China because there was no law that banned the insurance companies and the HMOs that banned them from reimbursing them or to connect the reimbursement to the legality of the medical procedure. So they went to China and they didn't have to pay not a cent out of their own pocket because they were fully reimbursed. So following this case, I started public campaign, published several papers and gathered the media in order to at least ban the reimbursement of Israeli patients. And to cut a long story short, 3 years later, in 2008, the Israeli parliament, following long and tedious meetings with us, myself and other transplant surgeons, passed the organ transplant law, which was passed in March 31st, 2008, that bans altogether any reimbursement of Israeli patients who receive their transplant abroad if the transplant is performed against local law and if the rules against organ trade as defined by the Israeli law are passed by this transplant. And since then, since 2008, not a single patient went anymore to China.
You also mentioned in your report that the religious authority, Rabbi Shalom Eliashiv, also ruled against use of transplant. Can you explain that as well and your role in getting that?
Yeah, that has been a very pleasant surprise, I would say, because if there is one local problem that we face in Israel is the fact that ultra-Orthodox Jewish rabbis, headed at that time by Rabbi Eliashiv, always rule against acceptance of brain death, which is a basic term that you need to define before a patient can be defined a potential organ donor. They don't consider brain death as a form of death, as according to them, the only way a person can die is by his heart, which stops beating, cardiac death. And in spite of that ruling, and in spite of the fact that until that time, these rabbis did not see any problems in Israeli patients going abroad and receiving organs from non-Jews, this particular rabbi, who was a leader of the ultra-Orthodox, came out very loudly against Israelis going to China because he considered the use of organs from executed prisoners and later on, as I found out and published from Prisoners of Conscience, as something that God does not allow, and he ruled definitely against it, and so we were backed by his ruling, and that was nice.
Thank you, Dr. Lavie. There will be questions from the tribunal.
Dr. Levy, thank you very much for appearing before us. May I just ask you about your patient specifically, that this is a patient who goes to China and comes back having had apparently a successful transplant. Did medical records come back with the patient? And if so, what did they say? And did they include any consent papers, for example, or what we would say in Europe as being an appropriate donor coordinator's form?
First of all, of the 10 Israeli patients who went to China for heart, only 6 came back. 4 did not come back. They died over there. Those who came back with a very brief one-page medical summary, which had no a recording of the source of the organs. It just mentioned that a suitable heart became available, period. Nothing about consent, not the source, what type of donor, nothing at all. In addition, the entire medical report was very succinct, did not give any details about the transplant itself, the post-op. It was very difficult to gather some medical information out of this, definitely nothing about the source of donors.
A 40% mortality even in that year, with very high mortality for transplantation. Yeah. Presumably, assuming that you're right, that these were organs potentially obtained on demand through some form of execution, then that doesn't really comply with good organ donor management. So do you think that, what do you know about, or what have you learnt about the way in which organs are obtained and the method, for example, of preservation of those organs for transplantation?
The only actual testimony of the way organs have been procured in the past is that of Dr. Wang Guoqi, who gave his testimony in front of the U.S. Senate back in 2001. And he then mentioned, and this was a case where kidneys were procured in an ambulance who was set at the yard of the prison. Immediately following the shotting of the prisoners, the still half-life bodies were rushed into the ambulance, which was equipped as an small operating room, and the kidneys were very quickly procured. And even if you're familiar with that particular testimony, he mentioned that even following the removal of the kidneys, the body wasn't dead enough, and it was thrown into the crematory half alive. But that obviously is not the setting to procure a heart. So I honestly don't know how the hearts were procured, whether these prisoners of conscience, whoever they were taken into the OR, and were they put to sleep before that? Was any type of anesthesia? I don't know. But you're definitely right that 40% mortality in heart transplant was bad result even at that time. So something went wrong, obviously, either with the selection of the potential candidate for heart donation or in the process itself. But definitely a 40% mortality is a very bad result, medical result.
Now, we've heard evidence today of blood tests being taken from people within a prison system in China, apparently for uncertain reasons. If such a system of organ collection was in existence, what blood tests would you feel you would want to know if you were in charge of the organ donation component of that work?
Well, obviously, in addition to the regular blood type, which is absolutely a necessity, the very basic requirements would be for the basic viral severe infections like hepatitis B, hepatitis C, HIV viruses, CMV, toxoplasma. There's a whole variety of viral examinations that any donor needs to undergo before being assured that he can be a safe donor. For example, I can tell you by talking to my colleagues who are kidney transplants in the various several centers in Israel, that over the years they have received several of those Israelis who went to China and came back with the kidneys with hepatitis B. There's a very high incidence of hepatitis B, hepatitis C, and even one incidence of an HIV, who received an HIV following a negative HIV in the recipient before he went to surgery. So not only high mortality, as I mentioned, in the heart, but there was a very high incidence of viral infectious disease of those kidney patients who came back. I cannot say that of those 6 heart patients who came back, none of them brought back any viral problems, but definitely there was a high incidence of those problems in the kidney transplanted patients.
So, with your patient going over, if we can sort of focus on that particular incident, he's got insurance clearance to go, and he goes over. What information did you have on him that would need to be matched at the other end? Presumably some form of tissue typing, PRAs or something like that as well. Would you have any of that information?
Well, you mean we handled all the information when he went over to China, but we have no idea whether there was any matching over there. As I said, the brief one-page medical summary that he brought back with him said nothing about it. It simply mentioned that a suitable heart became available, an orthotopic heart transplant has been undertaken, the patient received these drugs, period. I mean, only 2-3 paragraphs, that's it.
At the time that this happened, do we know how insurance companies were interacting with the Chinese authorities? Whether this was being done through direct organ brokers or through some other system?
As far as I understood at that time, each of the HMOs or insurance company had their own local broker who was in touch with the broker over there in China, and the one over there was the one who arranged everything with the hospital. Obviously, I had nothing to do with that, but everything was run by brokers, again, which was totally banned and stopped since 2008.
And since you launched your very successful and admirable campaign to stop Israeli patients going over there, what has been the reaction from China to your activities and to what you've achieved?
Well, that's a very good question. At first, when I published my first paper in the journal of the Israel Medical Association calling for this was even before the law, calling for disengagement of Israel from China and mentioning this particular testimony of Dr. Gwocki and the fact that it's known now that organs are being taken from prisoners in China. Few days after the paper was published, I got a call from an Israeli lawyer who represented himself as representing a group named Israelis who support China. I found out later on there was no such group, okay? And he literally threatened me that if I continue with this type of publication and public campaign, that he would take me to court. Obviously, being an employee of a hospital which is run by the Israeli ministry, I contacted the legal department of the Ministry of Health, and I called him, and I didn't hear from that particular lawyer any further. Later on, I was the president at that time of the Israel Transplantation Society, and I arranged a specific meeting in Israel, a hearing about organ donation and transplantation, and I invited David Matas, whom I'm sure you know, or he'll appear in front of you as one of the speakers. And a few days before the meeting, which was a huge meeting, I got a call from our Ministry of Health requesting me very, very gently that they got a call from the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs if I could ask Dr. David Matas not to appear because the Chinese embassy in Israel didn't like the idea that I said, no way. I mean, David Matas will come and say. So they said, at least allow us to, somebody from the Chinese embassy to follow his speech and give his report. I said, fine, that's fair enough. So the Chinese representative gave his report following David Matas. To my total surprise, this gentleman was literally booed by the audience, audibly booed by the audience because he rejected the mere idea. Anyhow, over the years, I got calls, emails telling me that, how should I put it, I'm a sort of persona non grata in China, which is fine. I'm not going to go to China as a tourist. But I'm happy to say that I have managed through my activities in the international transplant communities, both in the Transplantation Society Ethics Committee and in the Declaration of Istanbul Castonia Group, in which I'm a member of a board of councillor, to bring the entire international community to see what's going on in China, and for many years, until the year 2014, to boycott totally any academic activities of Chinese transplant surgeons and physicians to take part in international meetings, to publish their papers in transplant journals. But then came the claims from China as of January 1st, 2015, they're going to reform their act in transplant and they won't use anymore any official prisoners as a source of organs. And that, unfortunately, has changed totally the attitude of the international transplant community, because now, I should open here brackets and say China, as you know, never admitted the use of prisoners of conscience, even to this day. But the international transplant community didn't pay attention to that part. For them, it was enough that the Chinese has reported as if the use of formal prisoners, executed prisoners, will stop. And all of a sudden, we see all the Chinese transplant surgeon and physician coming to international meetings. We see papers published. And that has made our life, the group that's been continuing to pursue the issue of the use of prisoners of conscience, much more difficult than before. But hopefully, within the next year or so, the new data that comes of China as of January 1st, 2015, showing that nothing has changed and things are continuing as before, will bring the international transplant community back to its attitude like before the claims of reform.
Much of the evidence that we've heard today has involved numbers. The mismatch between the numbers of donors from various sources, from executed prisoners, from official statistics, the lack of a registry and so on, and therefore the gap between them representing those that might come from prisoners of conscience. How would you sum up your observations on those numbers so that those of us who need a simple summary could take it in?
What I can say from my own investigations, my own recent research, is that the official number given by Chinese authorities, as if they're performing only 10,000, roughly 10,000 cases a year, is absolutely wrong. I'm not, unfortunately, not in a position to submit to you a manuscript that is right now under consideration for publication, and hopefully it will be published soon, and I'll submit it immediately once it's published, but written by myself and my colleague Matt Robertson and a statistician from Australia, Ray Hind. And it's based on solely on official publication coming of China, mainly in Chinese, about the actual number of organ donations taken care. And simply analyzing this data, you can see that the actual number of transplant is much, much higher than the officially claimed 10,000. As I said, I'm sorry, I cannot, being a paper under consideration, I cannot submit it now to the tribunal, but I promise to submit it immediately upon its publication.
Thank you. Can we ask you, I hate this question, something's up for peer review, you never know when it's coming back, but do you have any rough idea when it's coming out, and has the journal given any guidance about the final review?
I'm waiting for the editor's response within the next week or 10 days, and that has already followed a long exchange of emails between us. So I hope it's going to be very soon.
Thank you. Any more questions?
There's one you didn't make. Dr. Levy, one question. The patient who went away and came back with a heart, and any others of the cohort who came back with hearts whom you spoke to, did he or they give an account of the conversation they had either with the broker or the doctors, explaining where this heart on demand came from?
I asked this particular question, all of these patients, as you can imagine, and all of them came back to me with the same answer. We did not dare, that's what the word they use, we did not dare to ask our physicians or our brokers who were our donors. All of them knew from me personally what is the, in general, source of organ donors in China. So they knew, the patients. But each and everyone came back with the same answer. We didn't dare to ask our physicians over there or brokers or whoever whether this is indeed the source of their hearts.
For those people who are not in the transplant community, could you describe what would be an international ethical framework for the process of organ donation and receipt? How is that sort of generally managed around the world?
Well, in most, or I should say in all Western countries around the world, there's a national organization which takes care of all organ donors. This organization spreads a network of donor coordinators in each and every medical center who look for potential candidates, those who are become brain deaths, and recently those who are defined as circulatory death. And once death is defined by their physicians, those coordinators approach the family and ask for their consent for organ donation. And as you know, there are two types of consent in the world. There's an opting in and opting out. But even in those countries in which the policy is of opting out, namely every citizen is considered by potential an organ donor unless he opted out, even in those countries, the coordinators approach the family of the deceased and ask their permission. And in very rare cases, even in those cases in which the donor itself did not opt out while alive, if the family says no, then it's no, okay? So the final consent is both those of the deceased itself as he made it while alive, plus the consent of his first-degree relatives who are there, who give their consent for organ donation. And it's then, and only then, that the transplant community comes in, is being informed, and according to national candidate lists, every organ is allocated according to medical criteria. So the transplant surgeons of the various organs have nothing to do with the donor prior to the definition of death and prior to the consent, written consent of the deceased relatives.
So thank you very much. That's very helpful. I have one more question, which is, from your experience and not giving away the detail of your paper, do you think it's possible for the voluntary donation of organs to be commensurate with what the Chinese governments claim to be as productive in their organ transplantation as they are? Is there any way that could be a commensurate process?
Absolutely no. My answer is no with a capital N. There's no way any country in the world can switch within a year or two from a system that had no voluntary organ donation, had no, in a country in which the mere idea of brain death is unknown to the many of the public. There's no way a country can jump from within 2 or 3 years from zero consent donation to the numbers they are currently proclaiming. There are no miracles in this. We and everyone in this business, so to speak, of organ donation and transplantation, work our lives in order to make campaigns and persuade the public about the importance of organ donation. To think that the country can, within 2 or 3 years, jump from a total system that practically zero consent donation to what they claim 10,000 and what we know it's much higher number, there's absolutely no way that this can be achieved by organ donation which is given by consent.
Thank you very much. That's very clear. Do you have any more questions?
Dr. Levy, while I was listening to you, I was stimulated to ask just one more question that I suspect you won't be able to answer, but I'll try in any event. From all the information coming to you, and assuming, because obviously as a tribunal we at the moment are in that stage, assuming there has been the forced organ harvesting, as it is described, from conscientious objectors, and in particular Falun Gong, are you able to see what the underlying motive of whoever is responsible might be, as between, for example, commercial or some other?
Well, there's no doubt that there is a financial incentive, a big, huge financial incentive in that process. And I'm talking about not only the physician in the hospitals, I'm talking about, if you read the testimony of Dr. Walkie, I'm talking about starting from the courts, okay? Back then when they officially, so to speak, officially executed prisoners were the source. So the judges got their envelope, the guards in the prison, and so on and so forth, all the way down the chain to the hospital and physician. So financial incentive there was, but there has to be something in addition to the financial incentive to be able to create such a huge, monstrous system that executes thousands of people for their organs. I cannot imagine a country that executes this process only for the purpose of money. What is it? That's beyond me. There is a historian among you and so on, but it has to be something beyond money.
Some might argue that it has to do with the destruction of a particular group of individuals or groups. Do you know, or have you seen anything or heard anything to show that that is not possible?
Well, to answer your question, the answer is no. I haven't seen anything different. I can tell you once I visited years ago Taiwan during my international campaign to bring this story to the attention of any transplant and to the medical community, and I had the opportunity over there in Taiwan to speak to a Chinese heart transplant surgeon who worked earlier in mainland, not in Taiwan. And he confessed that he was part of the teams that procured the hearts, okay? And I did get a chance to ask him, what was your motivation? He told me we were totally blanked by our superiors and let assume that those donors are subhumans. And that's the only way I could explain to myself that what he said, that I can go ahead and procure the hearts from these people. So he was the only single Chinese surgeon that I don't remember his name. I'm sorry, but that's what he told me.
Thank you very much, and thank you again for making yourself available to give evidence to help this tribunal. Thank you, Dr. Levy.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Levy. Our next witness is Dr. Wang, if he's available in the room, or no, Marcus, maybe you have to. He's here. Yes. And he needs. Has he got a? Yeah. Good afternoon, Dr. Wang. Mr. Chairman, would you like to ask?
Dr. Wang, thank you for coming to the tribunal, keep our evidence, especially rather late in the day, but you're not the last. Please remember that in giving evidence, you must tell us the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
The translator.
Can you help
I'm
me?
so sorry if you didn't have... There they are. Perhaps you could... Yeah, that's fine. You can just check that's on the right.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you very much, everybody, and the
Did you,
all
let
the
me just
world.
interrupt you, Dr. Wang. Did you hear my suggestion that you should tell us the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
我也非常高兴。我是
I'm absolutely clear. What I'm doing here. Everything I say is true. I'm very glad to be here today to talk about this issue with everyone from the legal profession and everyone who cares about this issue all over the world. I represent WOIPFG and also represent everyone who loves this world, who loves the justice in this world. So everything I say is truth. All the evidence that I will bring forth today is supported. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Wang. You are the president of World Organization to Investigate the Persecution of Falun Gong, aren't you?
我是追查国际的主席。
I'm the president of WIPFG.
Can you briefly introduce this organization to the tribunal?
So WOIPFG was established on the 20th of January 2003, and the headquarters are in New York. We'll have branches in Australia, Canada, and Asia. Our motto is to investigate all the organizations, individuals who persecute Falun Gong, no matter where they are. No matter where they are, we will investigate to the end of the matter. After the establishment of our organization, from the 20th of January 2003, we have not stopped our investigations on the Chinese Communist Party's persecution of Falun Gong, and we have always published reports on our findings. Today, I would like to tell everyone about the results. If time is enough, I would like to report our recent findings on the current situation of organ harvesting on Falun Gong practitioners. The latest one was this year. The second.
Of this year, this month. this month?
The latest report was published on the 2nd of this month, and I can tell everyone now that the results are shocking.
Thank you, Dr. Wang. First of all, thank you very much for your elaborate and comprehensive work that has been submitted to this tribunal. In your introduction, you
应该的。
refer to the work that you have done, that you have taken evidence from 5 standing committee members of the Chinese Communist Party Central Politburo. You have spoken to a vice chairman of Central Military Commission and gone over the 3,000 medical papers and 9,519 doctors and 891 hospitals. An amazing feat. I would like you to take us through one by one the evidence that you're submitting to this tribunal, which is very substantial and needs all the time, and eventually we will get to the last paper that you have submitted regarding the recent developments in this field. If you have the English translation of your report, which starts from page 52 on the book that is next to you.
Okay. He is requesting for translation, and which I shall do. During our investigations, we investigated on five members of the Standing Committee of the Chinese Communist Party. The Minister of National Defense and the chief of the General Logistic Department of the Army.
当然了，我们
那些证据。
We have investigated on the major hospitals who have allegations of live organ harvesting. We have reference to the sources of all the cases. If you want further information, we can provide you. Some details are left out because of the limit on the length in this book. There was Zhang Gaoli, who is a member of the Politburo, the Standing Committee of the Politburo. When he visited Kazakhstan in 2015, I personally spoke with him on the phone for the evidence of live organ harvesting. I asked him at the time. I pretend to be Secretary Liu of the ex-president of China, Jiang Zemin. I said that I would like to stop investigations prosecution of Jiang Zemin, and Zhang Gaoli agreed. the reason why I talked to him I had the chance to talk to him personally was because during his visit it was easier to talk to him personally. In mainland China, they are not allowed to speak to people on their personal phones. They could only speak with red phones, which are public phones. There were tens and thousands of Falun Gong practitioners who petitioned to the highest offices of the Chinese Communist Party in accusation of Jiang Zemin, and we had handed in our report. Thirdly, Zhou Yongkang was sentenced to prison, but his sentence was very light because he had achievements, and he was one of the major chiefs, party chiefs under Jiang Zemin. And his political achievement was that he exposed Jiang Zemin's crime. That is why at this time I represented the highest level of the Chinese Communist Party and asked them about the issue that they cared about the most. Apart from the fact that I chased down to his whereabouts and his contact numbers, one of the most important reasons was that he was abroad.
That
maybe if you can identify and list the sources of material and take it to the points you want to help with, you'll have to be able to do that.
that's what I am going to do, sir.
It may be very frustrating.
Microphone, please. Microphone.
Mr. Sabi will ask you, and confine your answers to what he asks.
Your substantial report, I suggest that I summarize each one of the evidence and we go through the report as it is in front of you. And if you have a problem or you want to add anything, then you will stop me and you make your additional information. If you agree with what I summarize, you let me continue.
Yes, I agree.
He has the interpreter on stage. Yes, he has the interpreter on stage. Does he speak in Chinese? He has the interpreter on stage. We need to switch because we can't hear anything coming in. That's why we switch. Oh, I see.
Massive increase in the number of liver transplants. This is at page 54. That it went up 180 times between 1999 to 2006. Up to 1999, there were only 135 liver transplant cases in China. Then it was increased to 14,085 transplants, and the rate is ever increasing. And under evidence 4, we have the increase to be 436 times compared to what it was. And the last evidence shows that 4,231 liver transplant was completed in such a short period of time, between June 2006 to June 2007. In evidence 6, you refer to Hang Jae-fu carrying out a liver transplant with extra 3 livers as backup, a luxury that I guess no Western transplant doctor can ever have. Evidence 7 refers to multiple transplants, and 24 liver and kidney transplants were conducted only in 1 day. Evidence 8, page 55, recording a conversation with Dr. Chen Yongfeng, where he says we can select a good and relatively young liver. We have plenty of donors, so we can still select the ones that are young and good. Again, the transcript of all these telephone conversations are attached to this report. Your evidence 9 and 10 refers to delivery of kidneys within a short period of time. The first one says we can secure kidney within half a month, and the other one says less than 2 weeks. Evidence 11 is the advertising by a Hunan People's Hospital offering 20 free liver and kidney transplants. This is without any charge. They're freely available. Evidence 12 is again another advertisement for free transplant. Do you have the hospital? I would like to take a little bit of your time to go through your evidence 13. This is yeah, whatever. Is this the one in Shenyang? No, it's the other one. Shenyang, yeah? There was a general hospital in Shenyang. This is a conversation by the report by a military man who was present during a heart transplant. During a transplant, I'm not sure whether it was heart. If you go... This is at page 93 and 94 of this document, is the full transcript.
92. 这是那个是
The one you referred to was a policeman from Jingzhou in Liaoning province, and he witnessed the entire live organ harvesting. After he witnessed that, he came to us to report it and detailed what he saw. The victim was a woman, a Falun Gong practitioner in her 30s. Her heart was taken, her kidney were taken, her liver was taken as well. He said that apart from the organ harvesting, there was extraction of the brains, and even something more cruel than this. But he didn't talk about other cases in detail. And after we saw this, we thought there was much to do, because he mentioned the extraction of brains, he mentioned live organ harvesting. So I would like to let everyone know that the persecution of Falun Gong practitioners in China by the Chinese Communist Party is much worse than what we know now.
Let me read quickly through the statement that this is the transcript of the
现在要放录音吗？
witness statement. I'm reading quickly, Dr. Wang.
他是什么？
And this is the young military man that was present during this period. And he's asking
好，那他
the
读。
investigator that if I'm still alive, help me to distribute this information. And he promised to do so. It happened on 9th April 2002. It was 5 p.m. and it lasted for 3 hours. There's this young woman that she had already had countless wounds on her body. She had already become delirious. We used electric baton to beat her. She didn't want to eat. Then we forcibly fed milk into her stomach. We pinched her nose. Then she had to do instinctively to open her mouth. She had lost almost 15 gin, which is 7.5 kilos in that period. There were 2 people there. One of them was a military surgeon from General Hospital of Shenyang Military, and another one was a graduate of the 2nd Military Medical Service. They sent her into an operating room of a mental hospital and did the whole process. No anesthetics were used. They put a knife on her chest and their hands didn't tremble at all. If that had been me, my hands would have been trembling. I worked in the armed police. I had used guns and had done shooting before. I'd seen a lot of dead bodies as well. But when I saw those military doctors, what they did, I was impressed by them. I don't think he means impressed. Their hands were not trembling at all. They put a surgical mask and started cutting immediately. At the time, we were standing on guard, holding guns in our hand. Then she shouted, "Falun Dafa is great. Falun Dafa is good." She wailed and shouted, "Falun Dafa is good. You kill me one individual, but can you kill several 100 million of us, people who are being persecuted by you for our true belief?" At that moment, the military surgeon hesitated. Then he looked at me. Then at our superior, nodded. Then the surgeon continued. The heart was carved out first, then her kidneys. When her cardiac vessels were cut by the scissors, she started twitching. It was extremely horrible. I can imitate her scream for you. It sounds like something being ripped apart. The evidence listed there. Evidence 14 is recording on a policeman from, and says we can provide organs of Falun Gong practitioner. The transcript of that is available. Evidence 15 is the head of a hospital. Mr. Zhu Jiabin, head of general department. And when he was asked whether he carved out his organs, he says that he sold them. We sell all of them, he says. If you appeared in front of me, I would also live organ harvest you. Do you believe it or not? The next evidence, number 16, is a TV program in Canada, produced by Hong Kong satellite TV, where they attempt to deny the live organ harvesting. The rest, I suggest that the tribunal go through these evidence, which are substantially supported with the transcript of the telephone conversation and supported by hard evidence. And discuss the same with Dr. Wang. Thank you, Dr. Wang. The tribunal may have further questions for you.
Thank you.
Just one initial question. In evidence 1 and evidence 2, it suggests that some of the most senior people in the state are and were aware of these actions. Is it possible, given the nature of Chinese society, where there seems, and I may be mistaken here, but it appears that there is a culture of wishing to avoid responsibility, that people might say, it's my senior or it's the most senior person to avoid responsibility?
Yes, that's completely possible, because this crime is too serious. Once it's exposed, it will threaten their power, so it's obvious that they would like to evade responsibilities. They evade responsibilities in the following areas. After this has been exposed, the Chinese Communist Party has always denied it. Secondly, they're trying to destroy evidence which is included in our reports, in the reports of our organization. For example, the major responsible people, such as Zhou Yongkang, who was the highest chief to execute Jiang Zeming's policy of live organ harvesting, but they accused him of corruption to get rid of him. But in fact, they do this in order to destroy evidence. And also in order to decrease the anger from the Chinese people, from the citizens towards these people. Thirdly, they asked people themselves to confirm that organs come from voluntary donation from death row prisoners, and show to the world saying that these are death row prisoners. Of course, these are only a few aspects. Fourthly, they are using voluntary donation from the citizens. After it was exposed in 2006, their pretext was death row prisoners. But as the international community has paid more and more attention to this, especially accusing the Chinese government of using death row prisoners, because this is also not ethical. In 2010, they started. In 2010, the Chinese Communist Party started to say that the organs came from voluntary donation of ordinary citizens. In 2016, their discourse is that all the organs come from voluntary donation from the ordinary citizens. But I don't think they can cover this completely. And in the end, it's going to come back to them. Especially once they started saying that all the organs come from ordinary citizens, a voluntary donation, they are under pressure to prove this, such as a list of donors. But they have not been able to provide such a list. And now they don't emphasize on this anymore. I think they're thinking of another excuse. For example, last month, our organization published a report on a Beijing Red Cross, the Beijing Association of Red Cross, from the municipal bureau to the county bureau. Until now, they have not published the report. But now there are 23 hospitals in Beijing alone which perform organ harvesting.
Structure of this activity involves brokers. Have you ever obtained a list of these brokers? And if you have, would that be possible to make it available to the tribunal?
他是什么？
他就说不是有些器官中介吗？我们有没有一个找到一个名单呢？要是有的话，能不能就公开？
器官中。
The brokers, as for the brokers, let me tell everyone, this is another technique that the Chinese Communist Party uses to escape responsibility. I personally telephoned Dr. Li in the hospital in Beijing, and he clearly said, so I asked him clearly, openly, if certain organs came from brokers. He said yes. He said if the organs obtained from brokers were the same as the ones that you use, he said yes. I asked, are you still using healthy organs from Falun Gong practitioners? He said yes. So let me tell everyone that let me tell everyone that brokers are still an excuse for them to evade responsibilities. Now, let me tell you something that something that is still being investigated but hasn't been reported. On the internet, there are reports about brokers. Everyone knows that the Chinese Communist Party usually filters everything that is against their benefits, but there's still such evidence on the internet.
We haven't got very long, so we've got a few more questions to ask you, if you'll forgive us. Given the repression, are you able to estimate how many Falun Gong practitioners now remain detained across China? And a subsidiary question, which you, of course, entirely up to you whether you answer it, is are you yourself a Falun Gong practitioner?
I'd like to tell everyone that I'm a Falun Gong practitioner. I have been practicing Falun Gong since February 1998, and I've deeply felt the benefits of Falun Gong on one's spirit and body. It improves everyone's mental and physical health. As for how many people are still being persecuted, how many people whose organs have been harvested, I can tell everyone that the number is numerous and far more than we imagine. But until now, I've not been able to tell the exact number. The reason why I estimate that the number is great is because it is a state crime. It was the order of Jiang Zemin, the ex-president of China. It was executed by the highest level of the Chinese Communist Party. It was a top-down policy, and it was assisted by the army. It was facilitated and assisted by the armed forces, hospitals, and so on and so forth. It's a state crime started by the Chinese Communist Party. Based on the evidence of our investigations, hospitals all over China and over the last 10 years have always been doing live organ harvesting. But this is very secretive because the victims die inevitably. They can't go forward and speak out, and the people who are involved don't speak out. That's why I can't tell you the exact number, but I can tell you that this is an evil that has never occurred in the history of humanity.
Thank you.
Could I ask a question? Or how you
Write it down and give it to me.
I'll take yours after that. There's a question from one of my colleagues here. Could you explain how the Chinese state views Falun Gong, in the sense, does it view it as a religion or as a spiritual movement or a social group?
The Chinese Communist Party, in their view on Falun Gong, as far as I understand it, they should know that Falun Gong has no political ambition and is not like other religions. Falun Gong is a faith group. It's a group of people who have faith, who uphold truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance, which is the highest principle of humanity. But the reason why Falun Gong is persecuted is that the faith of Falun Gong and the influence of the Falun Gong has on the society scares the Chinese Communist Party, because the Chinese Communist Party is atheist. That's why it does not allow its citizens to have faith, and does not allow any faith group to grow powerful. It's a fundamental conflict of interest, because the Chinese Communist Party fears truth, fears truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance.
Would it be fair to say, therefore, or can I ask you the question rather, why did Jiang Zemin decide to suppress Falun Gong?
This is related to what I just said. Well, because Jiang Zemin was the highest leader of the Chinese Communist Party, so fundamentally he would not allow a faith group whose belief was different from the Chinese Communist Party to grow. He didn't want so many people to believe in deities. He didn't want so many people to uphold the principle of truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance, so as to threaten his power. And second reason was that he was jealous. He felt that so many people would listen to Falun Gong instead of him, and did things differently from what he wanted them to do, and he couldn't tolerate that. Thirdly, personally, I think that when Jiang Zemin gained power in politics and military, he had no foundation. Like his predecessors, he needed to strategically persecute a group of people to create terror in society in order to establish his authority. These Falun Gong practitioners did not have political ambition and would not resist. That is why he started persecuting them, but he realized that reality was contrary to what he had thought.
In your very helpful paper, you've described this as a genocide. Could you, as briefly as you can, please, define what you mean by that?
Genocide, that's to kill humans. This genocide is mobilized by the state machinery in the whole of China. Secondly, every victim of live organ harvesting died afterwards. Therefore, this is genocide. And that is why this is the most evil mass murder, the most evil genocide. And then I'd like to add that the big scale, the importance of the definition lies in the fact that it has lasted for more than 10 years.
Thank you. As to your personal definition of genocide, was there anything you wanted to add apart from the 10-year element? is there anything you want to add to your definition of genocide,
Yeah.
apart from the 10 years?
I'd like to add that the goal is not a minority which existed scattered in a scattered way. They would want complete annihilation, physical annihilation of everyone who practiced Falun Gong, and spiritual annihilation through the renunciation of their faith. So their goal was to the annihilation of the entire group of people.
Coming to give your evidence.
我还
You are,
能
of
不能再
course,
补充一点？
you are, of course, free to stay and watch the rest of the...
He'd like to add something, sorry.
Yes. You want to add something? Add it, please.
Yeah, also like to add, and I'd like to tell everyone that from the 19th of October to the 2nd of December this year, I have investigated major big hospitals of China which perform live organ harvesting. 2 days ago, we published the latest report on the Chinese Communist Party's crime of organ harvesting, which included several recordings. 11 provinces and cities, including Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen. 16 people were investigated. They were chiefs of the big hospitals. Some of them are influential internationally. They have admitted that, firstly, 11 of them directly admitted that they are still using organs from Falun Gong practitioners. The other ones did not deny.
Because it's quite difficult to hear you because the sound is louder than the interpretation, but also because we are running out of time. Can you please help us by either making sure your latest report covering this material is provided, or if not, then it needs to be written up separately. Could you write it up separately for us?
Yes, I can provide you with that. And I would like to just let everyone know that.
Please add to your testimony either by a published report or by an additional part to your statement. But we have a limited time and we have another witness.
可以，
Thank you.
我们这个已经在互联网上公开发表了。
Thank you.
He's already published on the internet, and he will do that. He will add to the witness report.
谢谢大家。
Mr. Ansley, thank you very much for making yourself available to the tribunal. I very much hope the timing is not inconvenient. Please be sure to tell us the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. You'll now be asked some questions, and then later some more questions by the tribunal. Yes.
Mr. Ansley, good morning, and thank you again for your patience with our slightly adjusted timetable. You have a legal practice and academic background with extensive involvement in the Chinese legal system, and an overview of that system is the basis for the report you've been asked to submit today, which the panel have had the benefit of reading. Can you tell us, is there an independent judiciary in China?
No, there's... Whoop, I'm sorry. I'm getting an echo here. Are you getting it on your end as well?
Yeah, we can hear you.
All right. No, there is no such thing as independence of the judiciary in China whatsoever.
Can you briefly describe how that lack of independence manifests in the court structure and the directions?
Yes, well, first of all, and I think I've alluded to these things in the materials I've given you, but first off, judges in all the courts in China at all levels are appointed by the People's Congress at that particular level, and they serve at the pleasure of the People's Congress, so they can be removed at any time as well as appointed. Now, the People's Congresses are composed of deputies who are 100% either members of the Communist Party or they have been approved to stand as candidates by the Communist Party. And so, in effect, this constitutional provision that the courts are responsible to the People's Congresses who have appointed them is tantamount to saying that they're responsible to the Chinese Communist Party, and they can be removed at any time from that. And I've had some personal opportunity in the past to observe that. Another factor is that if you look at the court structure, which is the same at any level, you can be dealing with the local court or the intermediate people's court or the higher people's court provincially. It doesn't matter. The structure and the process is the same in all of those courts. And there's an appeal process that's set out, but something that's never mentioned, but is the practice, is that the political and legal committee, political/legal committee, which is a committee of the Chinese Communist Party at the appropriate level. The chairperson of that committee stands at the very top of the structure. He can overrule any finding by any court at his level. And normally, this isn't always the case, but normally there's no legal training involved with this particular person. He's purely a political appointment.
Thank you. So in the absence of any independence, can you give us a brief explanation of what would happen in a standard criminal process from the moment of detention or arrest to trial?
Yes, when somebody is taken into detention, and if I can remember, I'll come back to it to point out that nowadays there are a number of different agencies that may bring this about. But if we look simply at the criminal procedure law in China, then we would anticipate a person would be detained by the police, the Public Security Bureau. And the detention is not the same thing as arrest. It strikes many Westerners as very strange that somebody may be may be detained and kept in detention for very lengthy periods, sometimes months, before the decision is taken. Arresting him, current status, he's in detention at the time, but it act on his rights in terms of access to counsel and so forth, with the emphasis on he will be detained under procedure law. He'll be deter.
We're having a slight...
in effect.
Sorry to interrupt. We're having a slight technical problem. Could I just ask you to pause for a moment until we can get the sound back properly? I hope he's heard.
I heard, yes.
Thank you. Okay.
Is that okay now?
There we go. I think we're back. Sorry, but could you just
All right.
rewind briefly, please?
All right. Yeah, That's one of my problems. So I'll try to move along. I won't go into the various time periods because they are very, very flexible. With the there are time periods that are set out in the Code of Procedure within has of the period of time a decision has to be made with respect to arrest and so forth. These provisions are mainly honored in the breach. There are ideologies such as, then. But the key is that throughout this period, from the time of arrest, the suspect will be interrogated by the Public Security Bureau and also often by the prosecutors, and he will have no access to counsel at that time. He also routinely will be subject to torture. When a decision is finally taken, it's actually Article 33, I think, of the Code of Criminal Procedure that specifies he may have a right to meet with legal counsel after the interrogation is finished, after the interrogators have finished with him, by which time they usually will have a confession. Then, in theory, he has a right to meeting with counsel. In practice, even then, the suspect very often does not get to meet with counsel. The lawyer that he may have retained is very often simply refused access by the guards at the detention center. And one of the things I remember reading about for the first time years and years ago, and I since have encountered it fairly frequently with lawyers, is that they will turn up. Pardon my voice, I've been fighting a health problem the last little while. But a lawyer typically will turn up once the interrogation has finished, and he now has supposedly a right to meet with his client. He'll turn up and demand that right, and he'll be told by the guards that it's not convenient today, or that the particular police officer involved in this case, who must be present for the meeting, is not available today. And the lawyer sometimes will say, look, I have a right to meet with counsel. Here it is under the Code of Criminal Procedure, and they'll show the guard the section under the Code of Criminal Procedure, and a guard will typically say, you're not being refused a meeting with your client under the Code of Criminal Procedure. You're being refused under the internal regulations of this detention center. So that's the kind of thing that the suspect is dealing with. And then ultimately, in the cause of brevity, I'll just skip ahead to when a trial is finally set. What is often not known, I think not very widely known at all in the West, and it doesn't show up when you read judgments from the court. But in virtually all cases, the trial takes place with witness statements against the accused, which are all written and signed by witnesses who are not present at the trial. And these will be read into the record, either by police officers or by prosecutors. So the defense has no all to cross-examine the witnesses. And
sorry, we've
this
got
is
another. Sorry, we've got another slight technical problem hearing you. Could you just hold on one moment? Are they going to switch it off?
If it continues, they will switch off the video, yes.
Are they going to make that decision?
They are making that decision.
Just one moment, please. Okay, we'll carry on again. Sorry, continue, please. Thank you.
Yes. Article 59 of the Code of Criminal Procedure specifies that in order for witness testimony to be accepted by the court and any reliance put on it, that the witness must have appeared personally in court and must have been cross-examined. Interestingly enough, the wording of the section says cross-examined by both sides, by the prosecution and the defense. And if that doesn't happen, the evidence is not admissible. But that never happens, virtually never happens. Virtually every trial, we see witness statements coming in simply by being read out from prosecutors or police officers, and no opportunity for cross-examination, whatever.
Thank you. Is there an assumption of innocence? A presumption of innocence?
There is no assumption of innocence. And this, again, I don't want to take too much of your time. I'm sure I've included it in the materials that I've submitted, but it's a greatly misunderstood issue outside of China. Many people think that there is a presumption of innocence written into the Code of Criminal Procedure. There are two things I would say to that. One, there is no presumption of innocence even written in to the criminal procedure law as it stands. Second thing is that it's very difficult to find a court or a judge in China that has very much interest in what the Code of Criminal Procedure says in any case. But there's an interesting history of this because the Chinese legal system has come under heavy criticism from Western jurists and legal scholars for many years. And one of the things that kept coming up over and over again was that there's no presumption of innocence. And so in the 1997 revision of the Code of Criminal Procedure, China purportedly answered this criticism, and they inserted Article 12 into the code, and Article 12 has been heralded ever since as being the enshrinement of the presumption of innocence. In fact, Article 12 simply says that no one shall be guilty of a crime until they have been found guilty by a Chinese court, which, as any Western jurist will readily appreciate, says nothing at all about the presumption of innocence. One of the interesting things is that most Chinese lawyers, and I must say that Chinese lawyers are not the weakness of the system. Chinese lawyers are a very select group, and lawyers that I hired while I was in China for my office, in the years they were hired, just to give you an example, sometimes 9% of the people who sat the bar exam passed. And so lawyers in general in China are brilliant, and their standards are as high as the standards of lawyers anywhere. It's the system that defeats them. It's not their inferiority. Nevertheless, most lawyers, Chinese lawyers that I've talked to, have mentioned the presumption of innocence, and almost with kind of a sort of pride that that was at least acknowledged in theory by the authorities in 1997. And So again, it's clear that they don't understand what it is. But sorry, short answer is no.
That's very helpful, thank you. Given what you've said about the lack of an independent judiciary and the lack of an assumption of innocence, is it right to say that a policy decided and determined by the ruling party could be enacted to determine the outcome of a criminal trial?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understood that question. And excuse me, I'm not crying because of the question. I have blocked tear ducts and a few other problems, and I mop my face a lot of the time. Go ahead.
It's the question that we had the problem. Given what you've said about the lack of independence and the lack of an assumption of innocence, is it correct to say that a policy of the government is facilitated in a way that can infiltrate the criminal system to determine the outcome of a trial or to determine whether or not somebody is detained?
Yeah, I'm still having a little trouble with that question, but I guess it's because of the wording about policy of government.
If it is sorry, go on.
It's not a frequent thing that we see that some particular policy of a government is made sort of the subject of a criminal case. What I can say is that the whole system is not set up to have an independent investigation. The examination, the investigation system by the police to start with, and then the process of the court, is never on the basis that we're going to look at evidence here and look at a fact situation and try to find the truth of something. The process is from beginning to end geared towards compiling evidence against a suspect who has been selected. That's the way it works.
Thank you very much. Understood. This question falls outside the general remit of your report, but are you able to comment on the status of Falun Gong within China and how they're treated in the legal system?
Well, one of the first things that happened in 1999, when the persecution of the Falun Gong first began, that there was the creation of the 610 office to start off with, the named for 6 for June and 10 for the 10th of June, the day that it was created and the day that the persecution began. And one of the things that was specified in connection with the 610 office was that the whole process of crushing Falun Gong and removing it from Chinese society would be handled by the 610 office, and that all other organizations, courts, prosecutors, police, everybody involved in the criminal justice system should defer to the 610 office, which was not an office consisting of legally trained people, and B, not an office that ever had any legal status in law at all. So we've got a court system set up here, and the government claiming the rule of law, and then the government just arbitrarily says, look, we've got a problem with this group called the Falun Gong, and our target is to remove them from Chinese society, to crush them, as language that was sometimes used. And we've created a special office, a special organization to take care of that, and the courts don't need to be involved. Now, I think in the materials that I selected to you, I perhaps oversimplified, and I said the normal process here is just for police officers to issue a decree sending somebody to a labor camp. When the 610 office became involved, they didn't necessarily start fulfilling all of these functions. And in some cases, they used police officers. In other cases, they actually did bring judges in to hold some sort of hearing, but the judges and the courts were taking their directions from the 610 office. The second thing is that everyone in, sorry, I'm getting off on something else again. You're talking specifically about the Falun Gong issue. How are they treated and how are they seen?
Yeah, what their status is in law, if it's different from any other groups.
Well,
which I think you have addressed,
stated.
so that's very helpful. Unless there's anything else you'd like to add, I think you have addressed that very helpfully.
Oh, okay. All right, fine.
I have one other question before we'll move to the panel. A number of Falun Gong practitioners travelled to Beijing or other main cities to appeal to the authorities to change their policy towards Falun Gong, believing that that right was guaranteed under the Constitution. Is that something you can comment on? The accuracy or otherwise of that?
Yes, well, it is accurate. That statement is accurate. But it's a very interesting concept. It's the right of petition that we're talking about. And long before the Chinese Communist Party took over, and long before there were any modern legal codes, that right of petition existed in the old dynastic system and in the old legal system. And it started actually at the local level, where we had a structure. It was called the Magistrates' Yamen, Y-A-M-E-N. I'm not sure how to translate that, but it's that structure consisted of the local magistrate's residence, as well as the facility where he held court. And citizens had a recognized right to come and beat on a drum before the magistrate's structure and present their grievances if they were being unfairly treated by local officials, by tax collectors, whoever it was. They could petition at this level. But if they didn't get satisfaction there, and maybe they included the magistrate after this first encounter, they might include him amongst their grievances. They were now entitled to go to Beijing and directly petition the emperor. We don't call him the emperor anymore, but today that right has been preserved, and it is there in Article 41 of the Constitution. And that Article 41 does not specifically use the word petition, I don't think, but it addresses the right of all citizens to come to a bureau, in effect is a petition bureau, and submit grievances against officials that they think have wronged them or any kind of injustice that's been carried out against them. And so that was a carryover. I mean, it was something in the Constitution that was very familiar to all Chinese citizens. And over the years leading up to the present, I would say because of the gross corruption and the abuses of power in China, there's been a rising tide of this petitioning. And I don't have any actual statistics on it, but I believe there are millions upon millions of people every year that have come to Beijing for this purpose. And perhaps because there are so many of them, the reaction of the government and the party has been essentially to just put the lid on it. They don't want to hear from these people, and they don't want these people coming to Beijing. And they, as a matter of fact, put a lot of pressure on local police forces in the cities and towns throughout China to prevent anybody in their jurisdictions from getting on the train and coming to Beijing to petition. nevertheless, a lot of them get through. And the local authorities will, in fact, send police to Beijing to try to pick people up before they can submit their grievances.
Thank you very much. Do you? No, questions now will come from the panel.
Thank you, Ms. Nice. Mr. Ansley, in light of your comprehensive written and now oral testimony, I can be, I hope, concise with about 4 topics. The first one, if you know, what is the current Chinese law on ownership of the body and thus the organs of someone executed in accordance with the Chinese capital punishment law?
According to the current position of the government, and there have been a number of laws dating back to the 1980s, I think, on the use of organs from prisoners, convicted Chinese criminal prisoners. But I'm not sure I can cite the particular law governing right now, but the more important position always is the official position of the Chinese Communist Party. And that is the position put forward by Huang Jiefu, who is the former Vice Minister of Health in China. And he is a person who, I think he's credited with about 5,000 liver transplants himself. He's a transplant surgeon, but he has been responsible for the entire program of organ transplants in China. And the legal position, which I think is essentially what you want, as stated by Huang Jiefu in, I guess it would be 2014, he was leading up to a change in 2015. And he said that on January 1st of 2015, there would no longer be any organs sourced from prisoners, and that would become illegal. And in a nutshell, the way that Huang Jiefu accomplished that, because China just very recently has claimed to have a volunteer organ donation system, but as far as any of the leading researchers can find, there have been very few voluntary donors under that system.
We've heard of that from elsewhere. It was just the definition of the law, and I think in a sense you've accounted for that. The second very general question is this: how, if at all, does the People's Republic of China acknowledge the non-binding validity of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights?
Could you repeat that, please?
Yes. How, if at all, does the Republic acknowledge, i.e. acknowledge as proper, the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which of course is not binding, but nevertheless it's what it is?
This is a very much off the top of my head comment, just from many things that I have seen. I'm not aware of any particular statement that they have made, but over and over again, you'll see the Chinese Communist Party and the government basically claiming that they do adhere to any number of universally recognized principles under the UN or under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. They may just claim arbitrarily and subjectively that they recognize them and they adhere to them and China is a country bound by the rule of law. But well, I'm not sure that's helpful to you, but...
Well, I think I may come back to your ungiven answer if I have time, but I want to ask you something specific arising from your very long and very helpfully listed set of things that you have set out between pages 3 and onwards. Item 19 on page 135 of our listing, or page 4 of your report, says that you presented a paper entitled Genocide Against the Falun Gong in the context of the supposedly reformed Chinese legal system. We can get that paper, but there's an audience of public here as well, and we've only got 10 minutes. And I've got 2 more questions. Could you, in a couple of sentences, or maybe 3 but not more, summarize your argument on genocide as presented in that paper?
I'll give you my argument right now. It's been so many years since I actually wrote that paper and looked at it that I'm not sure I'm giving a dead-on accurate summary. But the genocide, I think I started from the position that genocide, in order to qualify for that term, it doesn't have to be necessarily the attempt to wipe out an entire people, such as in the Holocaust, to physically wipe them out. I think it's enough to look at the statements from Jiang Zemin, who started this particular pogrom, and other Communist Party statements as well, that the goal is to entirely remove Falun Gong practitioners from Chinese society, to essentially achieve a situation where there are 0 Falun Gong practitioners. And there are many ways of doing that. And of course, there's overwhelming evidence of physical attempts to do that, of the numbers of Falun Gong people who have disappeared without a trace, and who some of them have been documented. The effects of torture on their body has been documented. So we've seen a lot of the physical evidence, but on top of that, the use of retraining, re-education centers to force Falun Gong practitioners to renounce their beliefs, and indeed to turn on the beliefs and the Falun Gong movement. And many of them have appeared on television with bowed heads denouncing Falun Gong. We also have prohibitions against employers employing Falun Gong people, seizures of property. So I was looking at, well beyond just the physical elimination of the movement.
Thank you. You realize that at the moment this tribunal has, of course, not made any decision or made its mind up. But if the evidence we've heard about killings is accurate, then standard scholarship would suggest that those engaged in the killings have to have been dehumanized. Or they don't have to be dehumanized, but the victims have to be dehumanized in their minds. From your experience, can you help us with how the process of allowing people to become dehumanized and thus to have been killed in the ways described has happened?
Yes, and as a matter of fact, elsewhere, not in a legal journal, but I did contribute a chapter to a book that was dealing very much with this. And it dealt with the last few years that I was in China and the absolute blitz in the mass media for a period of time, just totally focused on Falun Gong. And Falun Gong practitioners were demonized. In a way, I know that these kinds of comparisons are sort of cliched, but it did remind me of the demonization of the Jews under the Third Reich in Germany, because you couldn't open a newspaper, you couldn't turn on a TV, listen to a radio without hearing this non-stop attack on Falun Gong, and how the founder of Falun Gong, Li Hongzhi, was a totally evil person, and he had led people to commit all kinds of diabolical deeds. Claims were made that studying the works of Li Hongzhi led to people committing murders, rapes, mass murders through poisoning, and all kinds of things. And I've often, myself, in presentations in the West, I've often noted the anomaly that for all people resident in China, within the borders of China, reading the works of Li Hongzhi will lead to mass murder and rape and pillage and all kinds of things. But outside of China, I don't know how many millions of Falun Gong practitioners there are on other continents, but outside of China, to the best of my knowledge, the only Falun Gong practitioners who have ever been charged with a criminal offense were 3 middle-aged ladies in Singapore who were charged criminally with passing out pamphlets without permission. But otherwise, these teachings never lead to that kind of stuff. If I can just give you a couple of examples that I remember from newspaper and television. I remember one of my lawyers in my office who was extremely critical of the Chinese Communist Party. And she used to always make the kind of jokes of saying that the only true thing in the People's Daily is the date. And she would make fun over and over again of the Chinese Communist Party. And one day, somehow or other, the Falun Gong came up. And she launched into a tirade about these terrible, evil people, the Falun Gong people, and they should be wiped out. And I said, well, wait a minute. Where did you get that information from? Or no, I guess intervening. When I asked her first, she referred to a news item that I had seen myself the night before on the television, where a woman had killed her several children. I think she had 5 children, and she had killed them. And according to the news account, this was because she'd been studying the works of Li Hongzhi. And so my lawyer friend cited this case, and I said, how do you know that's true? And she said, I saw it on the news last night. And I said, who controls the news? Who determines what is shown on television news? Well, we skipped through that pretty quickly, and she agreed that, yes, the Chinese Communist Party determines that. Sorry, I can see that
your example and answer foresaw, perhaps, or forecast my next and nearly last question, which was to ask whether your experience of people in China can tell us how effective the demonization process was across different cadres or stratas, or if we're allowed to use the word, classes of society. Was it effective only against one class, all classes, and if so, or some, and if so, which?
My opinion would be, and I stress the word opinion because I didn't get to go and interview a lot of workers in factories and so forth, but my impression was that it was extremely effective. And one of the things that always puzzled me in China was that in my view, the overwhelming majority of the population had no respect for the Chinese Communist Party at all. They ridiculed it in private conversation. They attacked it for corruption. They attacked it for lying. And yet, if you had a discussion about capital punishment, for example, in my experience, but nearly 100% of Chinese people are in favor of capital punishment. And when you would talk to them about the possibility of the courts convicting an innocent person, they would say, well, he wouldn't have been in court if he wasn't guilty. And these are the very people, who are telling me about the evils of the party and how it controls the media and the courts, for that matter.
And for Falun Gong? And for the Falun Gong?
Well, yes, the same kind of thing. The people who hated the Communist Party and attacked their credibility would be quoting the Communist Party for their opinions of the Falun Gong. And they were all being filled full of these stories, like a man in Nanjing who was being executed for having put poison in the food in a noodle restaurant. And I think 42 people had died. And everybody knew this story, and everybody was attributing it to Falun Gong, because the last thought in the news items that announced that this person was going to be executed, been taken off for execution, was, oh, and by the way, he was a Falun Gong practitioner and had been studying the works of Li Hongzhi.
Thank you.
So I think it was very effective.
We are more or less out of time, but one of my colleagues may have one short question. I'm not sure.
I just wanted to ask really quickly if there are separate military courts that exist in China.
Yes, there are. There are a number of special courts, as they're called. Military courts is one category, railway courts another, railway maritime forestry courts.
And are the hearings in the military courts public or accessible?
No, and neither are the hearings in the ordinary courts, even though the Code of Criminal Procedure says they must be public. But public, there's a number of problems with it. One is that an exception is made for anything involving state secrets. And among the many definitions of state secrets is any information that has arisen from a criminal investigation. So mostly you don't have anybody sitting in the court, even though it's supposed to be public. But when you do, occasionally, because the Communist Party will want to hold a show trial and they'll want to demonstrate something, and they have the TV cameras there, then they'll fill up all the seats and it will look like a public hearing. The only thing is that you must have a ticket to get in to those trials. And most often, I won't say this always applies, but most often, even the relatives of the defendant won't be able to get a ticket. They won't be able to get in.
Mr. Ansley, thank you very much indeed for your evidence, for making yourself available at whatever inconvenient time of the day it may be. The tribunal is grateful to you. Thank you.
You're quite welcome.
Ms. Nice or Mr. Sabi, what time do we start tomorrow?
10 o'clock, sir. 10 o'clock, sharp.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for staying with the hearings today until 8 o'clock. It is valuable for all, including the witnesses. And for those who are coming tomorrow, 10 o'clock.